So how do we get our best ideas? Sheena Iyengar is the St. Lee Professor of Business at Columbia Business School and a world-renowned expert on innovation. Dr. Iyengar has spoken at global conferences such as the World Economic Forum and the Aspen Ideas Festival, and her insights have been featured in leading publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, and The Economist. She's also the author of 2 best-selling books, The Art of Choosing and Think Bigger. By the way, we have Think Bigger on sale right outside the door there. And her TED Talks have been viewed more than 8 million times. In 2024, Dr. Iyengar received the Scientific Impact Award from the Society of Experimental Social Psychology, recognizing 25 years of contributions. As a blind Indian American, Dr. Iyengar aspires to empower people to see possibilities where others see limitations, a vision she brings to life through her science, business, and leadership. And we've invited Dr. Iyengar here today to help us see new possibilities for creativity in our work as communicators. So it's a distinct honor to welcome to the stage Dr. Sheena Iyengar.
Good morning, everybody. Wow, that was an amazing set of introductions. I can tell you, it's almost never that I see such amazing lineup of quotes and a nice broad history of the way we've been thinking about creativity. So I'm really, really impressed. So thank you. You guys are in wonderful hands. They actually did part of my job for me. So this was perfect. So as you already know, I'm a blind Indian American and I'm going to add one more thing, I'm also a New Yorker. And I love New York, and so I want to start by using an example from New York. And that example I'm going to use to answer the big question, which I'm going to answer by the end of my short time with you, which is, where do big ideas come from, who gets them, and how do we get them? So that's the question we want to answer. And I'm going to start with an example from New York. So take a look at that unmistakable skyline, that thin spire atop a single tower, no twin next to it. Raised as the tallest structure in the United States, it reminds us of what we lost, what we survived, and what we still can and do look forward to with hope and resilience. The Freedom Tower is 1,776 feet tall. And it reminds us, it echoes with history. It echoes with the declaration that all of us have been created as equal and has been endowed with the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How fitting, then, that in the background of our Freedom Tower of the World Trade Center, we see our very own Lady Liberty. Held high in one hand is the torch, the guiding light, and in the other hand she holds a tablet upon which is inscribed July 4th, 1776. At her feet lies a shackle, a broken shackle, to commemorate the abolition of slavery and also to urge us to always pay attention to how to keep improving ourselves so that we can live up to our ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all. Now, as a New Yorker, I love Lady Liberty, Also because I am the daughter of immigrants, and as a blind woman, one of my favorite things to do, particularly when it's not freezing outside, is to get on a tandem bike, and don't worry, I'm not in the front, and I will bike down with a friend down to the edge of Manhattan, actually often with Columbia students from the cycling club. And I want to get there right before sunrise because I like to imagine all those ships that would come into our harbor. 14 million immigrants came via the harbor through Ellis Island. Only 2% were ever rejected. And they would time their arrival to be in sync with the sun as it rose on Lady Liberty so that they could behold the visage on Lady Liberty's face, because she, after all, would somehow tell them that as long as you dreamed, as long as you believed in yourself, this was a city you could come to and become whatever you wanted. And perhaps the best expression of that dream is echoed and expressed in the poem written by Emma Lazarus that hangs on a plaque that's on the pedestal upon which Lady Liberty now stands. And I'm going to play that poem for you.
Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that Twin Cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my light beside the golden door. Emma Lazarus.
New York City is often referred to as the Big Apple. It's certainly the home of big voices, big personalities, big money, big ambitions, and really big ideas. As the saying goes, if it wasn't invented here, it had to come here in order to become really big. And our colossal mother of exiles, who welcomes the yearning masses to her golden threshold, is without doubt a really big idea. So big that even today, over 100 years later, we still debate about it. We still argue about it, which is only a testament to the fact that it's such a big idea. Where did this idea come from? Where do big ideas come from? Who gets them and how do they get them? And that's what I strived to answer. Think bigger is a concept, it's a framework, it's a toolkit that enables you and anyone to try to come up with their best idea to solve for personal and professional problems. So I want to start by answering the question, how did this idea, that of Lady Liberty, come into being? Now this is Frederick Bartholdi, the artist that built Lady Liberty. And when you look at him building the structure, you're struck by the magic of him, his mythical powers. Certainly, what he created is great. And we often believe that when we behold people that have done great things, they must possess magical powers. Perhaps the idea came to them because they were born with it. Perhaps an apple fell upon their head. Perhaps they got, through divine intervention, the insights upon which that they got as they climbed the top of a mountain, or perhaps it came to them in a dream or when sitting in a bathtub. Well, I'm here to tell you that the ideas that come to them are not magic. Thanks to nearly 50 years of advances in neuro and cognitive science, much of which was actually conducted right here at Columbia University through the work of Eric Kandel in neuroscience, we can now tell you, we can trace for you the anatomy of how any idea, big or small, came into being. So, what I'm going to do is start by answering the question, where did Bartholdi get his idea? Now, mind you, when I tell you his story, I'm not going to tell you the story of the history books and the Disney films that talk about how he had to overcome incredible odds to build her, how he had to do crowdfunding to build her first in France, and then build her and build the pedestal upon which she stands here in New York. All of that is true, but none of that answered the question, how did he get his idea? And so the story I'm going to simply answer is, how did he get the idea? So, Frederick Bartholdi was born in the countryside in France. And when he was 2 years old, his father unexpectedly died. And his mother, who notices that he has artistic talent, moves to Paris. There he studies art, and as a young man, he's selected along with a set of other young people to be sent to Egypt to learn about the ancient artists. When in Egypt, he is mesmerized by the grand sculptures guarding the ancient Egyptian tombs. So much so that when they were contemplating building some sort of a thing at the opening of the Suez Canal, and they invited proposals, Frederick Bartholdi submitted a proposal of building and creating a giant woman dressed in robes, carrying the light. He called it the light to Asia. Well, it got rejected because they decided not to spend the money, and instead they built a lighthouse, which is what still stands there today. But the idea stuck. Later, when his friend Eduardo de Bollé was building Lady Liberty to help commemorate the 100 years of democracy and freedom in the United States, he asked Bartholdi to build it. So he has to come up with an idea. Well, he already has that woman in the large robes in his head. Now, at the time when he's building Lady Liberty, there's a very famous painting that's hanging in the Museo d'Orsay called La Vérité, the Lady of Truth, that was made by Lefebvre. Take a look at this painting and her pose. Now, of course, we're talking about Lady Liberty, not the Lady of Truth. You know, the French were enamored of Libertas, the Roman goddess. Every new republic, they tend to find some way to commemorate Libertas. And it was actually jingling in his pocket at the time in the form of a 5-franc coin. Take a look. Now, of course, you put all these pieces together, and what really captures the poet's hearts and minds is the face. Where did the face of Lady Liberty come from? That beckoning yet mysterious face. It was the face of the most important woman in his life, which was his mother. When he was asked if it was the face of his mother, he did not deny it. Now, when you put all these pieces together, you're at once saying, yes, I see it, but you know what? She stands for so much more. And indeed, she does. And yet, we now know that he merely took pieces that were familiar and appealing to him, and he combined them in a new and meaningful way. Now, of course, all of us all of us, every single day, from morning until night, are combining things in our head. And if we didn't do that, we would have the same thought over and over and over again throughout the day, and we would say the same sentence over and over and over again throughout the day, which I doubt we do. And yet, despite the fact that we're constantly coming up with ideas, most of our ideas don't make it to the level of Lady Liberty. Most of our ideas are at best mediocre. So what makes them stand apart? It's when the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And what is the signature of that whole being merely greater than the mere sum of the parts? It's when that idea goes beyond you, the creator, and others. Build upon it, embrace it, customize it, make it bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's what happened with Lady Liberty. Upon her unveiling, they asked Emma Lazarus to write a poem to read out at her unveiling. Now, Emma Lazarus wasn't French. She was a member of a Jewish family that had fled the Portuguese Inquisition. So she wrote her own take of what Lady Liberty stood for. In fact, later on, so she writes the poem, it's read at the unveiling, they put Lady Liberty in our harbor, and then later on, in the early 1900s, a descendant of Alexander Hamilton, one of the fathers of this nation and certainly the most important figure historically in New York City, his great-grandniece, Georgina Schuyler, finds this poem collecting dust in a bookstore, and she now puts in the effort to now put that poem on a plaque, which now sits on the pedestal upon which Lady Liberty stands. So it's a combination of people that came from such different backgrounds that makes Lady Liberty such a big idea. It's an idea that goes beyond the mere substance of her physical structure, and it's come to mean something to people all across the globe. Now let's look at another few examples of how big ideas come into being. Take a look at this painting, and I want you to just call out if you know who made this, or if you have any guesses, just call out. Now, what about this other painting? 1901 versus 1907. Most of us, though, wouldn't have thought it was the same artist. Two entirely different ways of painting, right? So what led to that transformation? And now you all are wise enough to know that it wasn't magic, even though Picasso might have wanted you to believe that. Now, there was an innovation in the 19th century, a technology which completely disrupted the art world. Can anyone tell me what was that technology? It was the camera. What did you say? Painting what? Oh, okay, interesting. Okay, so, well, I'm talking about the camera. You know, at the time when the camera was invented, right, the most common form of bread and butter for artists was making portraits, right? And so now you could take a portrait faster, cheaper, and more precise, right, with a camera. And so here's what you had critics say: from today, painting is dead. It's not long before art will be entirely supplanted by the camera. All you have to do is change the word camera to generative AI, and we know that we're in present times. Now, of course, we know that the camera did not kill art. It actually gave rise to new forms of art like Impressionism and Cubism. It even gave rise to this new form of art that took advantage of that technology called photography. Now, in 1906, Picasso, he's struggling, trying to figure out what to do with this how to create art that people actually want to buy. So in 1906, he's invited to Gertrude Stein's salon. And there he beholds the famous Impressionist painting by Matisse called The Joy of Life. Now, he sees that painting. Now, Matisse was influenced by his mentor, Cezanne. Take a look at the 5 bathers. Now, Matisse mesmerizes Picasso, and he asks to meet him. They meet in a cafe, and on his way to the cafe, Matisse happens to pick up an African sculpture from one of the French, that had just come in from one of the French colonies. And it is recorded by his secretary that throughout their meeting, the meeting between Picasso and Matisse, Picasso held that African sculpture and he kept fingering its lines, its ridges, its angles. And that very night he started to paint La Demoiselle d'Avignon. Take a look. Now, was Picasso? Well, there was also another contemporary of Picasso, another artist by the name of T.S. Eliot. You've probably heard of him, who famously wrote that immature poets imitate and mature poets steal. Now, was Picasso a thief? Or was he, like every great innovator, whether it's an artist, a scientist, an entrepreneur, someone who takes pieces drawn from distant and diverse sources and now combines them in a new and meaningful way? You know, another contemporary at the same time, Schumpeter, who was in Austria at the time, starts writing the treatise on economic development. And in there he argues that all innovation is nothing more, nothing less than a new combination of old ideas. And by the way, he got his ideas from somebody a few centuries earlier by the name of Sir Isaac Newton, who famously wrote in a letter, "If I have seen further, it is because I have stood on the shoulders of giants." That quote, too, isn't new. You can see remnants of it from the 10th century from a Cardiff. In Think Bigger, we define innovation in a very tactical way, right? We define innovation as a useful, novel combination of existing elements that come together to solve for a complex problem. That's essentially, in a nutshell, the methodology. Everything that I do in the course and everything I've done now, I'll end by showing you a generative AI software that actually helps you put this methodology to use. It's all about the operationalization of this very definition. Now, to give you a flavor of how this methodology works, I'm going to show you at least one case. Now, I figured, given there's so much stuff going on in the news every day, let's start with an innovation that's actually a lot of fun. No politician would argue with it. Everybody loves it, rich, poor, no matter what part of the planet. No single politician has ever found fault with it. And by the way, this is an innovation that was created by a woman, which is bonus. I'm talking about ice cream. And so the ice cream maker was invented by a woman by the name of Nancy Johnson in Philadelphia. She was a woman in her 50s, an ordinary woman, the wife of a chemist. She was a missionary. She was an abolitionist. So, did she invent ice cream itself? No, it existed. In fact, it was so popular amongst the forefathers of our nation that Washington paid $190 in those days dollars to have it delivered to his inauguration. So what made it so expensive back then? Well, you would take a bowl, you would fill it with ice, and I shouldn't break this. Okay, you would take a bowl, fill it with ice, and then you would take a smaller bowl and you would fill that with milk, and you would stir, 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 stir. It would be really hard to keep stirring it fast enough, so you'd get really tired. It would melt as you're stirring it, and it would form lumps. So it was really hard to make it right, which is what made it so expensive. So Nancy Johnson, and I'm going to tell you the story of the ice cream maker, and I want to tell you this story using very deliberative language so you get a feel for how we train people to think bigger. So we start with a problem. So the problem that she aims to solve is, how do we make the making of ice cream accessible to anyone. They notice I define the problem as a question. Now we're going to break down that problem into its most important subparts. And these subparts too will be framed as a question. How do I keep it cold? How do I make the stirring easier? How do I prevent the formation of lumps? So how do I keep it cold? So now she's going to take a water pail that had already been around for over 400 years. Notice how it's bigger and it's more narrow so you can trap the temperature. Now I'm going to put the milk, she says, in something that'll keep it cold. Well, what will keep it cold? Remember, this is the early 1800s. So she's looking around. What do we put things in when we want to keep it cold? Well, men drink beer in pewter mugs at the tavern in order to keep it cold. So what if we put the milk in pewter? Okay, that solves problem number one. Problem number two, how do I make the stirring easier? Well, what if I take those spatulas and I connect it to a hand grinder? Hand grinders were already in use for grinding coffee and spice, so she just connects them. But those spatulas would form lumps, right? Particularly if you're stirring and stirring. So now we get to the speculation part. Where did she get the idea of putting the holes in the spatulas? It is speculated that because she was an abolitionist who was involved with the Underground Railroad, you were more likely to have people run away from the sugar plantations where life expectancy was lower than the other plantations. Now, on the sugar plantations, they would make molasses where they would have to stir really fast sugar and hot water and prevent the formation of crystals. And so they would use spatulas with holes in them. So if it could work for hot liquid, could it work for cold liquid? Now, if you put these pieces together, you have what was dubbed by the Library of Congress in 1843 a disruptive technology. So as you can see that even back then this word existed, this is not new. So what is the methodology? We teach people how to define a problem, how to break it down into its most important subparts. We usually try to limit you to 5, and that's for cognitive limitations reasons. If I had more time with you, I'd tell you why. And then for each subproblem, you now go out into the world and you search for how to solve what pieces might solve for that subproblem. And then you combine, create a combination. Now, truth be told, she had to combine lots and lots and lots of things, right? We only know the one that won. To assume you're going to be combining a lot. In fact, when Edison made his light bulb, 2,774 iterations before he got it right. So it takes persistence. You got to try many, many, many combinations. You just want to be strategic about which pieces you try to combine. By the way, even in the case of Edison, he had to search beyond his laboratory to find the missing piece, and he found it in the form of a guy by the name of Lewis Latimer, who was the son of freed blacks, who is the one who introduced Edison to the idea of bamboo filament, which was finally when Edison got the missing piece of how to make the light bulb actually stay on for more than 30 minutes before burning. Now, let me give you one more example, and that's Henry Ford. This time I'm going to go through it much faster because you're wiser. Problem, how do I make an affordable car? Henry Ford did not invent the car. Henry Ford did not invent assembly line either. Those are myths. Those are not true. He took credit for both. Okay, so how do I invent the affordable car? How do I make an affordable car? Back then they were $2,000. Oldsmobile was selling them for $2,000. Oldsmobile had already figured out how to use the assembly line to lower the cost of labor. So what are the classic problems that Henry Ford has to solve, which we still have today? How do I cut the cost of labor? How do I reduce the amount of time it takes to build a car? How do I reduce the cost of material? He strategically copies, we don't use the word steal, he strategically copies from Oldsmobile the idea of the assembly line, which is going to help reduce the cost of labor by paying labor less. But it still takes 13 hours to build a damn car. And so he has his engineer go around the country to all different factories to do all kinds of things. And his engineer, William, who we rarely hear about in history, his engineer, William, discovers something called the moving disassembly line in the slaughterhouses of Chicago. So the animal is put on tracks and it's moving to the labor. Labor, does whatever it needs to prepare this meat for packing and putting on a train to go across the country. And so William discovers this and he brings this concept to Henry Ford. And so they say, okay, let's put the car on a track. So now the car moves to the labor rather than the other way around. And by doing that simple change, you can now make the car in 3 hours as opposed to 13 hours. That is huge. Also, by taking advantage of this special paint called Japanning that existed in Europe. It was a cheap paint that looked like a Japanese black lacquer that would dry within 2 days. Back then, you could have your car in any color you wanted by Oldsmobile, but it would take 14 days to dry. And so Henry Ford said, well, you can have your car in any color you want as long as it's black. And so you put these pieces together and you could now sell the car for $300. Now, what's important about this story that builds on the previous one is we all know the imperative, think out of the box. And we all try. But has anyone ever told you how? And I'm telling you how. It's actually very systematic and very strategic, and anyone can do it. In order to think out of the box, you just have to go to other boxes. Right? It's the art of that search. It's asking yourself, who has solved this problem? Or this kind of a problem? Even Reed Hastings, he didn't have to steal in an illegal way. He just strategically copied, and by strategically copy, he killed Blockbuster. You guys probably remember Blockbuster. He stole the idea that we all love to watch movies at home, but we hate having to move our butt to go get the movie. We hate late fees, and we want an infinite supply of movies. So he looked at other industries. So who solved the problem of me not wanting to move my butt? Amazon. Who sold? Books. Right? Well, if you can get books in the mail, why can't you get a movie in the mail? Well, now I don't want to pay late fees, nor do I want to buy a movie, unlike books. I don't want to own a ton of movies. I still, want to just see them and then get rid of them. And so who solved the problem of me doing a leisure activity as much or as little as I want, but I don't have to pay a late fee, nor do I have to rent? Leisure activities like gym membership. So all he did was take Blockbuster plus Amazon, who sold books, plus Planet Fitness, and he revolutionized home entertainment. That's how we create winning ideas. So, now, how does the mind create these ideas? Well, there's always the flash of insight, and I love the fact that they've asked you that question. When did you have your creative spark? So I'm going to tell you what we learned from Eric Kandel about that spark. So if you think back, the last time you had your best idea, chances are you were in the shower, you were doing some form of exercise, you were taking a nap. Those are our favorite places. By the way, 80% of our flashes of insight actually happen when we're busy at work. We just, don't admire them. They're not memorable. They're kind of boring. Part of our normal routine. And that's fine. We don't need to remember them. 20% of our ideas come unexpectedly. And by the way, about 20% of our flashes of insight work out. That's pretty good if you think about it, because it kind of just happens without doing much work. 20% just come. Now, how do you get that flash of insight that's going to actually work out? Well, you now know. You got to know the problem. You got to have all the pieces that you need. You have to know how to combine them. If you think about your brain, it's a giant inventory system. Or an Excel spreadsheet. You're collecting pieces from the moment you were born, unconsciously, consciously. You're doing that every single day, too. You learn something, and you're putting it in one of the shelves of your mind, and then I ask you a question. Like this question. Tell me the answer quick. It's not a trick. 60, right? Because you know what a 28 is, a plus, a 32, and you almost on autopilot do this. Now, what if I gave you this question? It's a trick. What's the answer? It's actually the same, but you have to know ancient Greek. Okay? Now, if you don't have the pieces to solve it, it isn't going to magically appear in your brain through divine intervention. You're only as good as whatever knowledge you got up there. Now, what if I were to ask you to come up with a word that rhymes with airplane that's not a real word? Just give me a word. It's not a trick. Good. So what did she have to do? She had to come up with a word that ends with ain. She knows to do that. And then she had to go through her brain of all different consonants or little syllables that she could put in front. And then she combines them to make it sound like a real word. But then she has to compare that against her knowledge of the English dictionary to make sure it's not a real word. She did all that in a fraction of a second. Did you notice that? So it's actually pretty good. She's almost like an AI machine, right? And she didn't even hallucinate, which is even better, right? And so notice, though, you did it quickly, whether it's 28 plus 32 or a word that rhymes with airplane. Did you notice that the process was very similar? Did you notice that? If you look at physicists and creative writers under the fMRI machine as they're doing their labor of love, the similar portions of their brain are lighting up. Most of it is happening right here behind this in your prefrontal cortex. There is no such thing as a right-brained person and a left-brained person. There is no such thing as a creative type or an analytic type. That is a myth. Could you have been born with an extra preference for music? Could you have been born with an extra preference for, building things and taking them apart? Sure, you might have been born with a preference, or you might have been exposed to something when you were young that just got you started. Your ability to solve problems depends on how many information bits you have collected in your brain. And the more bits you have, the more capacity you have to combine. Even when you take a genius like Einstein, when he died, they actually took his brain, they stole it. You can go see it in the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia if you're curious. They preserved it, they compared it to normal people's brains, and they have yet to find how our brains are different, or at least his brain is different. But I can tell you a fact that we do know for sure about Einstein. And that is that he spent 7 years as a patent officer learning about a lot of things in a deep way. He learned about cameras, refrigeration, typewriters, all kinds of things, even dabbled in fashion, made some weirdo blouse. And so he had all these information bits that he could work with, right? In his own words, when he was asked what was his creative process, he referred to his time as a patent officer as his worldly cloister in which he hatched his most beautiful ideas. Now, I have some more slides here, which I'm going to skip over, but I'm going to share them with you, that shows you the comparison of mind wandering and brainstorming and ChatGPT. But essentially, we have all this information in our head. Brainstorming, I'm combining my head and your heads, a few other people. That helps, because other people might know something that I don't know. It's in the box thinking, in the sense that the knowledge is now limited to to the knowledge that exists in that group, and to whatever we've gotten everybody's brain to go to, right? Because we're not going to access the entire brain. We're just going to access whatever we've told their brains to all go to. So it can create a kind of echo chamber. Then you have ChatGPT, which, think of it as accessing the world's information to the extent that it's been shared. But it's also accessing the most frequently occurring ideas, right? So it does lead to more conformist thinking. And it also keeps iterating. It doesn't actually know the difference between fact and opinion often, which is what we call hallucination. We as humans also hallucinate. It's just, until recent political figures came into being, we usually used to be a little more cognizant of the difference between what was fact versus not fact, and I suspect they are still cognizant. But the ChatGPT has a little bit of a difficulty with that. So we also know how to hallucinate. We're just a little better about usually distinguishing between the two. What Think Bigger does, if you just look at that method I showed you, we do strategic flashes of insight. And we can make it even more efficient and even more expansive through the use of generative AI. And so what it is conceptually is you take a choice. Can you go to the choice map, Eleanor? We take the choice map. This is like a simple depiction of it. You take a choice map. At the top, you put in the problem. And as your dean so aptly put, defining that problem is key, and you can't delegate that to anything. As Einstein said, if I had an hour to save the planet, I'd spend the first 55 minutes thinking about the problem and the last 5 minutes thinking about the solution. Even with the advent of generative AI, you are the one who has to define that problem. So you define the problem, you break it down, the subproblems. Make sure those subproblems are non-redundant and non-overlapping. Now, for each subproblem, you go out into the world and you search for strategies. You search for strategies that exist in your industry. You search for strategies that exist in other industries. And you even go into historical times. Now, we tried to do this as humans. On average, you would pay a consultant to take about 6 to 8 weeks to do it. I would have students do this up until 3 months ago. They also would use Google and libraries, et cetera. It takes, about 6 weeks. And even then, there's a lot of variation in their quality. Today, you can do it in less than an hour, even 15 minutes. Okay? And so it's that search that's really, really critical. And so you fill the choice map with options, different ways in which you can solve each of your subproblem. And then you line up one option per subproblem. You line them up in your brain and you say, what could I create? Now, we as humans do have some biases. We tend to want to combine only certain ideas and might miss other opportunities. That, too, generative AI can make that process more efficient because it doesn't have a bias, and also it doesn't get tired. So it can endlessly combine, right? And so the choice map here, even if you had a 5x5 choice map, you can get 3,125 different unique solutions.